This is a 2017 Alfa Romeo Giulia Quadrifoglio, and it's become a total bargain. 10 years ago, when this was a new car, it had over 500 horsepower and a sticker price of around 80 grand. These days, 10 years later, it still has over 500 horsepower, but you can routinely buy these early Giulia Quads for around 20 grand, and that strikes me as a lot of car for the money. Today I'm going to review this heavily depreciated used Giulia and show you all of its quirks and features. Before I get started, big news! This Giulia Quadrifoglio is currently for sale and it's being auctioned live on Cars and Bids. This one's gonna be a great deal. It has over 100,000 miles, but it's finished in the best color for one of these, in pretty nice shape, and it has limited modifications, and you can buy it on Cars and Bids. So, once you finish watching this video, click the link in the description below to visit the live auction for this Giulia Quadrifoglio, where you can bid on it and buy it only on Cars and Bids. If you're listing a car on Cars and Bids, you want the best possible result, and that starts with presentation. I always tell our community that ceramic made simple is the way to go. Mothers has formulated these products for fanatics, meaning you get professional grade results that are incredibly user-friendly. You don't need a professional detailer to get that deep gloss. It's affordable, it's accessible at basically any auto parts store, and it's the single best way to add curb appeal to your auction listing before you hit that submit button. Visit mothers.com to find out more and to purchase Mothers products. All right, time for the quirks and features of the Alfa Romeo Giulia Quadrifoglio, starting with a little background. So the Giulia, this car, came out in 2016 as Alfa Romeo's direct rival to cars like the BMW 3 Series and Mercedes-Benz C-Class. And this car was a big deal for a lot of reasons, but the biggest deal, at least here in North America, was that it marked the return of Alfa Romeo. Alfa left the US market after 1995, and they'd been back with a couple of low-volume sports cars, the 8C, which was very limited production, and then the 4C, which was more common but still very focused. This was the return of Alfa Romeo to the United States with like a mainstream car that people would buy. It was a huge deal in the States for that reason. And some more big news with this car was the switch to rear-wheel drive. Years before this, decades actually, Alfa had abandoned rear-wheel drive and switched to front-wheel drive, which is a little bit less enthusiasty. And I always thought it was kind of an odd decision for Alfa, which was ostensibly kind of an enthusiast brand. But with the Giulia, it marked the return of Alfa Romeo to rear-wheel drive, not just in the States, but globally when this car launched. And it put Alfa back on the radar of some enthusiasts who hadn't considered front-wheel drive Alfas before. But the Giulia's most exciting news may well have been the powertrains. In North America, the Giulia launched with two powertrain options. Regular Giulia models got a turbo 4-cylinder with about 280 horsepower, but if you stepped up to this, the high-performance Giulia Quadrifoglio, you got a twin-turbo V6 with 505 horsepower, which was an absolutely massive figure for the time and still today. Back then, the competing BMW M3, which is probably this car's closest rival, had only 425 horsepower, 80 less than the Giulia Quad. And even if you stepped up to the M3 competition, it wasn't much competition for the Giulia Quad. That got you 444 horses. You were 60 back still of Alfa's new sports sedan. With that said, pricing was a bit of a stumbling block even from the very beginning. Despite this new cool brand, rear-wheel drive, and all that power, $74,000, the starting price of a Giulia Quad, and that was big money for what was in North America, to most car buyers, an unproven brand. Alfa hadn't been here in 20 years, it was very unfamiliar, and that was big money, especially because well-equipped, often these were pushing 80 grand. Again, strong money for a relatively unknown, kind of uncertain brand, at least in the States. The good news is 10 years of depreciation has since happened to this car, and now on Cars and Bids, we routinely sell early Giulia Quadrifoglio models for $20,000 to $30,000, which again seems like pretty reasonable money for a powerful, special, cool, high-performance sports sedan. But anyway, next up, onto the exterior quirks of this car. One thing I always thought was interesting is there's not that many ways to tell apart the Quadrifoglio, the high-performance version, from the regular Alfa Giulia. The M3, the AMG C63, very distinct from their lesser counterparts. But with this car, they really let you option up a regular Giulia to almost completely look like a Giulia Quad, I assume because they just really wanted to sell any or as many as they possibly could, and letting people kind of dress it up like the performance version was part of that. Nonetheless, there are some telltale signs you're looking at a Quadrifoglio, and the most obvious is right here. This little triangular fender badge that shows a 4-leaf clover. The 4-leaf clover is a historical Alfa Romeo racing symbol. It was a good luck charm that an Alfa racing driver used over 100 years ago, and the symbol has always stuck with Alfa's cars, and it appears on the front fenders of the Quadrifoglio models to signify their specialness relative to other Alfas. You may have also noticed it under the hood where it appears on the engine cover. It doesn't say Quadrifoglio there or outside the car anywhere. It doesn't have to. If you know this badge, you know what you're looking at. Also worth pointing out that only the Quadrifoglio got this little fender vent on the side. The regular Giulia models did not, which helped distinguish it a bit more. And there were some other kind of subtle distinctions, like for example, the carbon fiber on the rocker panels. You can see that was a Quadrifoglio thing, and this carbon fiber rear spoiler, kind of small, but tacked there on the trunk was Quadrifoglio specific, and the rear splitter. That's another big way to tell it apart. It was a very aggressive, very race car-ish rear splitter that includes quad exhaust, and that was certainly distinctive to the Quadrifoglio, and they made quite some sound. This powertrain, when you rev it, you can really hear it. Take a listen. Now, another cool exterior quirk of this car, these wheels, which interestingly are not distinctive to the Quadrifoglio. Again, lesser models can be optioned with these wheels, but they were rare on lesser versions and common on the Quadrifoglio, and they look so cool, so aggressive. These kind of thin spokes that make circles. They are very racy, sporty wheels, especially when they are just in front of bright yellow brake calipers, which also look very racy and sporty, and that's especially true when you combine it with this color, which to me was always the color for this car. It was called Rosso Alfa, or Alpha Red, and it was just the correct color that these were supposed to come in, and especially paired with these wheels and the yellow brakes and the 4-leaf clover on the fender, you almost had something of like a Ferrari sedan. It really had that aggressive sports car feel. And the overall styling of this car certainly helped too. The general look of the Giulia was and still is both beautiful and attractive and cool, and they just nailed the design of this car completely. It was gorgeous, it was racy, it was special, it was great. And pair that with all the little details I just mentioned, plus the Alfa Romeo-ness, the Alfa distinctive front grille, and you had this like cool special car. It was Italian. It brought a new flair to this sports sedan segment, a new look, a new car, a new brand, sort of a new life. It was fresh, it was new, in a segment that had kind of been dominated by the same basic cars for a while. And that was a big deal, a huge selling point of the Giulia, especially when it first came out. But as exciting as the hype was around this car when it first came out, things got a little less exciting when you climbed inside. When the Giulia was new, a lot of its criticisms centered on the interior. Alfa's parent brand was Fiat Chrysler, and so there was a lot of sharing between this performance sedan, expensive car, and a lot lesser vehicles from the Dodge and Chrysler portfolio. And you could see it in a lot of places, like the window switches, for example, seemed borrowed from cheaper Dodges and Chryslers. Same deal with the power mirror control. It was also true of like the steering wheel buttons, for example. They were kind of taken right off of relatively inexpensive Dodge and Chrysler products at the time. And the gear selector was maybe the most obvious example. Very plasticky, very flimsy, and maybe not quite befitting what you'd expect to find on a car they were trying to sell for $80,000. Now, I piled on with those criticisms at the time as well, but I must say I'm sitting in this car now with over 100,000 miles, and the interior's actually held up. It may not be the nicest materials, but they were certainly durable materials, and I'm actually surprised to see how relatively nice things look in here. It hasn't worn, it hasn't faded, you don't have creaks and rattles, stuff broken. It actually looks pretty nice. And the overall interior design was always pretty cool. It has kind of this swooping dashboard and this angled center stack look. There was pretty liberal use of carbon fiber all throughout the center control stack, the dashboard, the steering wheel got a lot of carbon fiber. It was a nice, attractive, kind of cool, stylish interior that was let down by what we thought were crappy materials. But looking at this car now, I'm wondering if maybe they really weren't so bad. Plus, the seats in this interior were and are excellent. You can see very heavily bolstered sports seats with nice contrast stitching on the edges, and the seat centers in Alcantara were intended to keep you there, add some friction to resist sliding and hard cornering, and they too have held up well. Over 100,000 miles. It really doesn't look like that with these seats. I'm shocked at how well this car is worn and how relatively durable this interior has turned out to be. It's also cool that the key matches the color of the car. You can see the backside is the same Rosso Alfa as the car with the famous Alfa Romeo badge. It looks really cool, although I must concede that if you flip the key over, you are greeted by the buttons that, again, come straight from Chrysler products, and this key fob is used in a lot of different cheaper cars, once again, like other stuff in this interior. But anyway, moving on to a few other interesting quirks inside this car, starting with, well, the starter. When you get inside and start this car, the button isn't to the right of the steering wheel like in most cars. Instead, it's this little red circle hanging off the steering wheel, which almost seems Ferrari-ish. Ferrari was doing this in this era, the start-stop button on the steering wheel, and the Alfa looks just the same, and it looks cool. And also like Ferrari, you had a very prominent drive mode selector, unfortunately not located on the steering wheel like in Ferraris in this period, but instead in the center console. It is a rather large dial, and you can see it has, well, 3 letters, DNA, which stood for dynamic or sport mode, N was natural or regular mode, and A was advanced, which for some reason was eco mode. I imagine DNA had to translate into a bunch of languages, so they had to look for words that would work in Italian and English and maybe others, and so that's how you ended up with that. But the real key of this drive mode dial is at the top you have race mode, and you twist it all the way to the right, you switch into race mode, which does quite a few things at once. For one, you can see it defaults to turning on the sport suspension, which can also be accessed by pressing a button inside the drive mode selector at any time. But in race mode, it goes on instantly. Race mode also lets you know that you should be driving the car in manual mode instead of automatic, because race is optimized for manual mode. And race mode also turns off your driver aids, like your forward collision warning, and turns off your traction control. It really wants you to go have fun. If you've chosen race mode, you're going fast. And by the way, speaking of manual mode and the transmission, I have to hand it to Alfa for these shift paddles, which are not only metal, like you would expect to see in a true high-end exotic sports car, but they are mounted on the steering column, which is exactly what you want, not on the wheel itself. And so if you're in a turn, you're never kind of struggling and wondering where your paddles are. They're always in the same spot, fixed in place, which is great. And the gear selector has a nice performance car touch too. When you move it into manual mode, if you want to shift using the gear selector itself, upshift is down and downshift is up, which to me is the correct way to do it if you're a performance car. If you're going into a corner trying to downshift, your weight is going forward, you want to be pushing forward to downshift. I think that's the right way it's done, and they've done it correctly here. So there are some real performance car details they've thought about. One lovely quirk of the shifter, by the way, if you have it in manual mode, sort of skewed off to the side, and you press P to go into park, the gear selector will automatically move itself back over to the center and get out of manual mode as if an unseen ghost has just pushed it over there, and so it can correctly go into park. Kind of an interesting quirk. Other interesting quirks, to the left of the steering wheel and kind of below the dashboard of the driver footwell, you have this panel. You open it up and there's a little storage compartment in there, little hidden storage where you can store little hidden items. The infotainment system in this car has some pros and cons. One pro is its sort of angled look, which perfectly fits with the style and design of this dashboard. It's actually a pretty cool thing, especially back then where most infotainment systems were just straight rectangles. This system is intuitive, it's high resolution, easy to figure out, but unfortunately it is not a touchscreen. In order to control this infotainment system, you're using this large circular center controller in the center console, along with a few supporting buttons around it. And of course, that makes it relatively clunky to operate, especially in these modern days where touchscreens have taken over with instant responses. Also worth pointing out, the backup camera in this car is pretty high resolution, but quite small, almost laughably so. It's clearly kind of an afterthought, but it is there, of course, because it's mandated by law. One nice benefit here in the center control stack is that the climate controls are not integrated into the infotainment system, and so you can adjust your climate controls, your fan speed, your heated seats, etc. with physical buttons and dials rather than going into the screen. Now, as for the gauge cluster, the gauges themselves are pretty cool. Old school analog gauges, as you can see, they look nice, they look sporty, kind of a cool font, and the speedometer even has the Quadrifoglio symbol, the lucky charm, the four-leaf clover, which kind of adds to the specialness of the car. In the gauge cluster, there is also a screen, which was actually pretty advanced for 2016 when this car came out. A full-color, kind of high-res screen is a bit of a surprise, and it shows you various information. Strangely enough, it is controlled with a button at the end of the windshield wiper stalk. So you press this button, and that adjusts the info you see on that screen. Not all that common to use the wiper stalk for anything other than wiper, because most people don't want to press a button at the end. They think it's going to squirt water on their windshield, which it does in a lot of cars. Well, in this one, it just controls your gauge cluster. Not the best layout. Probably could have figured out something better for that. And speaking of the stalks off the steering column, I will perpetually be annoyed with turn signals that return to center when you put the signal on. You push down, it pops right back to center, the signal stays on, you try to turn it off by going the other way, then you turn on the other signal. It is just not a great design. BMW pioneered it 20 years ago, and they ditched it because people hated it, and it's a shame to see it proliferate to other brands, including this otherwise very usable car. And next we move on to the back seat, which is, well, it's tight back here. For an adult, it is a pretty tight place to be. You can see knee room. I'm squinched up here. Foot room is also at a premium. I have the driver's seat where I would be sitting in this car, and there is not room for a second me in back. Only smaller adults or everybody kind of compromising on position is really going to work in here. And even though this is set up for 3 across rear seating, you can't really get anybody in the middle seat because the hump in the floor for the driveline going through the car car is so massively big that there is nowhere for rear center seat passengers to put their legs, let alone their feet. You just wouldn't have a comfortable time 3 across and back. You barely would have a comfortable time 2 across and back. With that said, it's nice to have a USB charge port back here. Only one single USB-A port. This was a different era, but it's still nice to have that in this car, along with climate vents, which you weren't always seeing in cars like this at this price point in this era, but it's nice to have. Strangely enough, despite those niceties, you do not back here have a fold-down center armrest, which is sort of like the basic thing that most vehicles have in their back seat. You don't get it here. You also don't have rear cup holders in this car, unfortunately, which kind of subtracts a little from the rear comfort and convenience. You do, however, have the same Alcantara seat centers that you had up front, along with some of the same red contrast stitching, which at least makes the back seat look cool, even if it's not the most functional or the most comfortable. And finally, we move on to the cargo area, the trunk in the Giulia. Pop it open, and you get in. You can see there is a Giulia gym bag, which contains the cargo cover, but you don't have to use it for that. You can use it as a gym bag, and wouldn't you be cool in the gym if you had one? Interestingly enough, this trunk is quite large. It goes very deep. It's got a lot of space, but the opening for this trunk is quite small. There really isn't a huge amount. It's a surprisingly small little mouth that the trunk has, even though the trunk itself is quite big, so some stuff might actually be able to fit in the trunk. It just can't fit into the trunk, which is kind of an odd design. But there you go. Those are your quirks and features of the Giulia Quadrifoglio. Now let's get this car out on the road and see if 100,000 miles later, it's still fun to drive and it really is a bargain. All right, driving a 102,000 mile Giulia Quadrifoglio. I drove one of these. I reviewed for my channel when it was a brand new car. When it first came out and it was all the rage. It was the biggest deal. Like, what's the Giulia like? Me and Filippo actually filmed the video. We were living in Philly. We went all the way down to DC to film a video with it because the car was so like hot. And that was, you know, 8-7 years ago. It was a long time. And now here we are driving a 102,000 mile one. They've gotten to this point. I am astonished by how well this interior has held up. It does not look radically different than the 0-mile car that I drove all those years ago when this was brand new. Some of the Alcantara has worn a little bit, like on the steering wheel. Even the seat centers, though, which are Alcantara, have held up astonishingly well. The plastic, like there is not, usually like some frequently touched button, you know, is partially worn and you can't read what it says anymore or something. This car has held up shockingly after all these miles. Obviously, this has nothing to do with mechanical reliability, but looking around the interior, I'm like, maybe this isn't as bad as I expected. And on the outside, I also wouldn't expect this as a 102,000 mile car either. But it actually goes even further than that, because driving this car is also surprisingly nice. When you first start it up, there's a little bit of a weird idle for like 30 seconds. However, this car does have a few light modifications. Maybe that causes it. After that ends, it calms down. And again, I'm driving this car and I am not feeling dramatically different than the feelings I had when I drove this car back when it was a new car. It's jerky. But that was always how these were. These were always pretty hard-edged in terms of suspension, in terms of touchiness of the accelerator pedal and the brake pedal. Like, they were always like pretty immediate cars, particularly for sport sedans from 2017, 18, 19. Like, they were always pretty tough, pretty immediate cars. This is definitely still like that, but I don't think there's a problem. Oh, it's so fast. That's the other thing. This car always was fast, and it still is fast. This powertrain is exceptional. It really, really is. This small little V6, I've never felt it sounded amazing, but it drives great and it has great power at all speeds. Low speeds, mid-range, it is a powerful car and a powerful engine, and it feels excellent. It's also surprisingly quiet. It's interesting because I don't think of this car as particularly refined. In fact, I've always thought of it as kind of punishing, which it is, because of its immediacy. I'm not even in the sportiest mode. I'm in D, which I think is dynamic, and I'm still kind of getting beat up by the ride. And you know, the pedals are touching, all that. But when you're actually driving around, if you can get past the general uncomfortability of like a high-strung sports sedan, it's actually quite quiet in here and the seats are quite nice. It's a little bit of a dual personality situation. But man, this car is just, it really is a treat, and I'm astonished by how much of a treat it is all these years later, when I would have expected that these had all kind of wasted away to total crap. This one is either really well kept, or maybe it's a lot of highway miles, or maybe they're actually not so bad. And maybe this is one of those cheat code cars like the Aston Martin V8 Vantage, where the manufacturer's reputation causes significant depreciation, but the car itself is actually better than the reputation, and so you can benefit from the reputation even though you don't actually have the pitfalls of it. Oh, this powertrain's so good. God, I love driving these things fast. The car is just so immediate. Where it's a problem when you're going at low speeds in traffic, where it feels bumpy and the accelerator feels too touchy and all that, when you start to actually get on it, those things become real benefits to this car. The touchy accelerator, you go when you want to go. The twitchy steering, you turn when you want to turn. There is a precision to this car that I truly believe makes the F80 BMW M3 feel like a lazy car by comparison. It also has a rougher ride, a touchier brake pedal. There are some things that make it a little bit more, let's say, hardcore. There are definitely people who want that. There are definitely people who don't, and I totally understand that. But man, this car just has this wonderful immediacy to it that really makes it pretty cool. And I really like the steering and handling. The steering is tight and quick. The chassis is great, ready to move, flat, very eager to go. And it's also, in my opinion, it was always more attractive than its competition. I always loved how these looked. But also it's like, it's got more flair. Like, it's more interesting. It's more unusual and exciting and kind of cool in a way, having an Alfa. I will say I'm also pretty impressed with the transmission. It's not that quick. It's not a dual clutch. But I like how relatively rough the shifts feel, even though they're pretty quick. I don't love rough shifts when they're slow. I think that's just sloppy and slows the car down. But I like a good rough shift when they're fast, because it's doing the job correctly, but it's also adding like a little bit of mechanicality to the car that makes it fun. This car still has all of that pleasure and all of that fun and all of that flair, except at a vastly lower price that makes it, in my opinion, pretty appealing if you're willing to, you know, roll the dice on Alfa Romeo, which, I don't know, maybe it's worth it. This car is cool. And so that's the 2017 Alfa Romeo Giulia Quadrifoglio. These are fast cars. They look cool, they drive well, they're fun and exciting and special, and they're cheap if you're willing to roll the dice on an aging Alfa Romeo. If you are, you can get this one on Cars and Bids. And now it's time to give the Giulia Quadrifoglio a DougScore. And the DougScore is here, 63 out of 100, which puts the Giulia Quadrifoglio here against similar cars. The Giulia Quad is a really interesting car. It's harsh and immediate, like a true sports car, but that's a problem for slow speed around town daily driving, which a sedan should be good at. It's really beautiful, like some of its Italian sports car brethren, but is it reliable? This one is held up shockingly well, but do we know how it'll fare mechanically from here? It's a bargain, but will it stay a bargain with maintenance? I have no idea, but I enjoyed this car a lot more than I expected to, given the mileage and how relatively affordable it is now.